World War II Deluxe, the war in Europe. And right there, the title tells you a lot of what my intro needs to tell you. You know the topic already, you know it's a fancy edition, you know it does not portray all of World War II, but it portrays all of the big chunk of the war that took place in Europe. And in fact, if you take into account the number of people that were involved in the conflict, World War II probably could also be called just the Great German-Russian War and Friends, because most of the war did happen on the Eastern Front. So you have that. Now, this is a kind of topic, of course, that feels very daunting when you hear that there is a game that tries to capture this topic at the grand strategic level. You're wondering, how many pages will the rulebook be? 200, 300? What's the ballpark? This is actually a game in a trend that we've seen in the last couple of years, so what I would call bonsai games. They capture these immense events in as lean a way as possible. Quartermaster General did that very well. It does portray World War II on an even grander scale because it tries to capture all of it, and yet it still has a lean rulebook and you can still play it in a single evening. It is not a monster game. And that is a game that does that by hardwiring a lot of historical events and capabilities of the various sides of the conflict by using decks of cards. World War II Deluxe, the war in Europe, is even more economic in that sense because at first sight it is really old school. It is just hex and counter, and those hexes look like traditional hexes. There isn't any fancy handling of the grid there, and those counters, they have movement and combat. What? How can they do that? How can they give you such a simple game to represent such an event? So I understand if you're suspicious and you think there's going to be just a World War II themed game as opposed to a game that is about the war. I played the game in solitaire, controlling all sides to the best of my possibilities. I can tell you the game can perfectly play that way. In a single evening you can refight the main theater of the war. Of course, you can play it against other humans. And a little warning, I brought the game with me my recent vacation in Italy, so the main segment of this video was filmed there. I don't have the box to show you. That's one of the reasons, because it is in a bigger box that is being shipped back to the US right now. Also, I filmed that segment in our vacation home that has pretty bare walls, so I'm afraid there's going to be more echo there than in my usual videos. I apologize in advance for that, but without further ado, let me first show you how the game works, and then I'll tell a little bit about my experience of playing World War II Deluxe, the war in Europe. This game, remember, has the word Deluxe in the title, so as you may imagine, it comes with a mounted map. Pretty nice, large access, very easy to read, nothing fancy, but again, very, very practical. It represents, well, the Western theater of operations. Again, the terrain is very easy to tell apart. There are important cities on the board. You see them there. They have these dark dots. These are production cities, and you will use them to generate production points that then will allow you to bring units onto the map and also to upgrade, reduce units. Speaking of the units, there aren't many in the game. There is a number that is, well, just right. Certainly less than you expect from most games about World War II at the grand strategic level. And here we go. This is all. These are all the military units that you need to fight World War II in the West. They won't even all be on the board at the beginning of the game. They won't all be available, of course. Say the US is not there, starting neutrality. Soviet Union's, the units are set up already, or most of them, but also is neutral. So as you can imagine, there will be a couple of rules to describe and influence and alter the political situation of the various countries. Now, the counters, again, not many, so the game is very easy to set up, at least compared to other games about World War II at this level. And as for the units, they're represented by these counters that are pretty large and nice and thick, and I also say they're very easy to punch. Basically, they fall off the frame, and they are large, very easy to read. Those are great for those of you that grew not only gray but also blind in the service of wargaming. And they have a symbol that represents the kind of unit that is, infantry, armor, artillery, etc., etc. And then basically two factors, combat factor and movement factor. It's that simple, nothing fancy. The two things that you really need to know to represent military capabilities, because military units, with the exception of forts, tend to move and attack. And then we also have a smaller factor that some units have, which is anti-submarine warfare. Now, you will place, of course, the units on the board. I'm gonna put down some units kind of randomly, just to give you a sense. You'll put down some units on the board based on the scenario instructions of the scenario that you're playing. And there is a scenario for the entire war, and then you have smaller scenarios. They all still go to the same place, that is to the end of the war, but they simply start from different times, from different positions. The later you start in the war, and then of course the shorter the scenario. So some things will be obvious. Don't put submarines on mountains, etc., etc., etc. Paratroopers, spring power drop, and so on and so forth. Now, at the beginning of a turn in the sequence of play, you have strategic warfare. That is when units, air units of both sides can attack production cities of the opponent. The opponent can try to stop them, intercept them with their own air units, so there will be combat, and then if the attacker is still there, the attacker will execute bombing against the production city of the opponent. That right there leads us into combat, which is pretty interesting because combat is resolved on a single table, and a pretty ingenious table this is, because it's so economic, because as you can see, every time you will resolve combat, you will simply look at the column that you're using. Say I'm trying to bomb you and you intercept me, then I have air versus air, and after that, if I'm still there, I'll do city bombing. So you just use the line that corresponds to the type of combat you are performing. And when people attack, they attack separately. That is pretty much I put together all of the combat value that I have, identify the right column, and then I roll down that column, and I roll 2 dice on that column, and I learn about how many points of damage I inflict on you. Each point of damage, you reduce one of your units, or you eliminate one of your reduced units. So I do that with my combat factors, you do that with your combat factors, we apply the damage simultaneously, and that's it, and that's combat. Also, if you're doing land combat, you take into account the terrain of the defender that will give you shifts. And then we have also, again in combat, then also the loser. You count and see who has inflicted the most hits. The defender that loses will have to retreat, and the opponent can enter that area. But compared to most combat systems, it's incredibly simple, incredibly economic, and yet it works. It still gives you a sense of the different capabilities of different types of units. Pretty impressive, huh? So, where were we? Our detailed sequence of play. We had strategic warfare, when you attack production cities of the opponent, and then after that you have production. You will want to do that. So countries will count how many production points are generated by production cities. Different countries have slightly different rules. So say Great Britain also get production points from their dominions abroad. The US can send production points to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, and those points need to be shipped through the ocean. And and naval units of the German player in the Atlantic box can try to intercept and sink those points. But the general idea is that once you have your production points, you determine how many you have, you will spend them, and we have a reminder here on the table of how much it costs to do what with production points. And again, it's so simple, it's so very straightforward. One production point will create or upgrade an infantry unit or an artillery. 2 productions will create a fort, and 1 will upgrade a fort, and then everything else takes 2 production points to create and later to upgrade. It is that simple. So where were we? Yes, we did strategic warfare, then we did production. Now the Axis player goes. The Axis player has the initiative. When it is your turn to activate your units, well, you guessed it, you first move and then you attack. When you move, you will stop when you enter the zone of control of an enemy unit. Land units will project a zone of control in the axis surrounding them. We do like that. We do like that, and we after movement, then the active player can declare combat. And combat is, well, I think you remember that. You put together all the combat factors of the attacking player, see if there is any modifier based on terrain of the opponent. If you're doing land combat, look at the table, see how many damage you inflict, and then the opponent does the same and inflicts damage on you. Again, you won't roll simultaneously, but the results apply simultaneously. After that, the ally player takes their turn, which works exactly the same. That is, first moving any and all units, or none, if that is the choice by the player, and then resolve combat in all situations where the ally player can and wants to resolve combat. Finally, we have the armored action. Now, the armor units get an extra move, but after that move, the armor units get an extra move, and first we have the Axis armored action. The armor units get an extra move, and then all land units can attack. Then we have the Allied armored action, in which all armored units of the Allied player can move, and then all land units can attack. Then you check for supply, very important. You need to be supplied to the capital of your country. And then that's the end of the turn. You go to the next turn. Well, you do a couple of the usual, upkeep functions, and then you go to the next turn. Political situations will change. Things will be unlocked at certain turns. Say the Soviet Union will enter the game when in winter 1942, or when attacked, whatever comes first, and so on and so forth. But in general, this is such a simple game. In general, pretty much all you need to do is you bomb the production cities of the opponent, possibly resolve air combat there. You use production points, Axis player moves and fights, ally player moves and fights, armored action phase for the Axis player, armored action phase for the ally player, supply, and that's it. You repeat that turn after turn from fall 1939 to summer 1945, and at the point you determine victory. Victory is based on how many countries Germany or the Axis control at the end. Well, you need to save Germany if you're the Axis player, and then the level of victory is based on how many countries you also control. Control a lot of them, you will have, as the Axis player, a major or even a total victory, a minor victory. Not many countries are controlled by the Axis, then the Allies will have a total or major or minor victory. Let's address the biggest tank in the room, which is, yes, this is a game about World War II. It feels like it is about World War II. And when you know that, if you're paid attention, you know this is a game that you can teach and learn easily, that you can play in an evening, you can set up in a reasonable time. It is a non-monster game about a monster topic, and that still connects to that topic in a significant way, Well, when you have that, you know it's a good game. I mean, definitely I enjoy playing the game, and I enjoyed once again yet having the privilege of exploring such an inspiring event in a way that is manageable and playable. I didn't have to get an additional PhD to learn the game. I didn't have to get an extra vacation to set it up. I was just able to put it to the table, play it entirely, put it back in the box in a single evening. I guess if it was a long, sleepless night or night with very little sleep, I could have played twice in a single night. It is that streamlined, it is that playable, and yet it is all there. The victory conditions may be simplistic to some. It's just Germany tried to grab as many countries as possible, but is it really that unhistorical? It works for me. It gives me enough of a sense of what that is supposed to do. Maybe from the historical point of view, North Africa feels a little bit underused, but if you think about it, that also historically was a little bit of a sideshow. So the main things that happen on the main continent are there. You have, as Germany, an initial advantage at the beginning. You should try to grab countries right and left. Meanwhile, the US is there looming in the background, first with Lend-Lease, then they may join the war directly. And so you have, well, the Allies strike back. And so you have to try, as the German player, to grab as many countries as possible and solidify your position before various behemoths start crashing you from all directions. And well, we know what happens at that point. We know the challenges that the historical counterpart had. You as the German player may try to do better, but it is tough. It is just a game that does have, in fact, enough historical flavor for me to feel that it is not just war-themed, but yet it is so playable. And again, don't be fooled by the fact that the game is basically so simple. It's almost not much more than move and fight. Yeah, there's an extra movement. Yes, there are some specific rules to handle some specific country's behavior, but it is that simple. And yet it is all there. So don't be fooled by the simplicity of the rules, of the map, of the game pieces, because there is depth in this game, because there are a lot of difficult choices. Even the fact you foreknowledge that, well, at some point my allies will strike back, that is not that anti-historical. I recently read this book by Max Hastings, Inferno, in which basically brings evidence that in late 1941, several German leaders already knew we're gonna lose this. So the fact that you know that at some point the Allies will strike back, will push back, even that foreknowledge is not unwelcome when you take that element into account. So this is a very playable monster, mini monster, pseudo monster. It does what monster games do, but it does it without monstrifying the situation. It does it in a span of time and with an expenditure of energy that actually will fit in a normal life. So that is quite remarkable. When I find a game that lets me play World War II in a single evening and still gives me those events, still gives me Poland and France and Barbarossa, and everything then coming down to apocalypse at the end, to me that is a great game. It has a sandboxy nature because you can really go everywhere, but in a certain sense, again, the general script will tend to follow historical lines. So at least the incentives that are based on the forces on the board and the geography will tend to make Poland feel very appealing and France very tempting and stuff like that. But you don't have to. You can explore a lot of what-if scenarios, and that sandboxing nature, of course, makes the game even more appealing. Especially because one evening you test a what-if and the following evening another one, as opposed to with a monster game you want to test a what-if and then 6 months later you can test another one. World War II Deluxe. It's Deluxe, it looks so great. World War II Deluxe, The War in Europe. It is a fun, playable pseudo-monster that is a good game for beginner war gamers, but I think it also has a lot to offer for veterans among us. It is a game where you can play the climatic event of modern history, one of the most climatic of all of human history, in a way that is manageable, playable, and enjoyable. And to me, that is no small achievement.